Ticklish business any way you look at it. Come on, we'll stick together.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Ticklish Business, the podcast all about honoring and celebrating classic film. We are back. It's 2025, and I have the sheer joy of getting to talk about a book that I am super excited to kick 2025 off. And it's not Al Pacino's autobiography, which I've already read. So, but we are going to be talking about the new book, Love, Queenie, Merle Oberon, Hollywood's first South Asian star, with its author, Mayukh Sen. How are you?
I am doing okay. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing great. I get to talk to you about Merle Oberon, which you can't see it, but over on my dresser over here, I might post a picture of it online, but I was at a thrift store in Palm Springs last year, and they had a signed photo of Merle Oberon that I bought for a very affordable $50. And so she sits in a frame on my dresser. And when people come by and ask if that's my grandmother, I just joke and say, yeah, it's Grandma Merle.
That's
So
hilarious. What is the photo? Like, do you know what movie it's from?
it's a
Because I have.
still, no, it's a still. It's just like a publicity photo. So it's like, I'm assuming it's just one of many press photos she took. I'll send you a picture of it. It's really cool. I was shocked to find it in the desert. Like just sitting there. Nobody had bought it. And I don't know if it's her signature. You might be able to tell me if it's more legit, but I felt very cool getting to have it. But I mean, you have written how many books are there about Merle Oberon? I think I've only read one.
So there's only one. Well, actually, let me correct myself. So there is one proper biography of her prior to mine, and that was written in 1983. It was called Princess Merle. It was co-authored by Charles Hyam and Roy Mosley. Anyone who knows anything about Hollywood history probably is familiar with the name Charles Hyam for various reasons. I'll leave it at that for now. There was also a novel based on her life called Queenie that came out in the mid 1980s, and it was penned by her once nephew by marriage, Michael Korda. And in addition to that, there was a book that was published on her in Australia in the late aughts by Bob Casey, but that, to my knowledge, has not been published outside of Australia. So my book is very much the first biography of her in over 4 decades since Princess Merle came out. And that was a responsibility that I really tried my best not to take lightly because I did feel as though there's so much misinformation out there about Merle that I really needed to correct. But we can probably get into that in a
I
bit.
was gonna say we'll get back to Charles Hyam in a second. I mean, I always say I'm a big Veronica Lake fan. Everybody always asks me, how did you get into her out of all the big stars, the top tier, the A on the call sheets. Veronica Lake is not necessarily a number one on the list of classic film stars. So I'm always fascinated when someone is interested in someone that unfortunately time just has kind of disappeared. What and inspired you to write about Merle? What was the gateway into her life?
Totally. So my first encounter with Merle was in the summer of 2009. I was a rising senior in high school. So, out my childhood, I had nursed this kind of obsession with the Oscars, right? I was one of those people who hoarded old issues of Entertainment Weekly and just kind of pored over the predictions and everything like that. And so I remember I made it a point that summer to essentially study the history of the Academy Awards. And like a lot of other gay boys, I was obsessed with the Best Actress category in particular, right? And so I was just looking through the list of nominees, and I remember I came across her name. And I clicked, it was probably Wikipedia, I clicked on her name and I was just totally stunned by what I read of her backstory. The fact that her mother had been South Asian, that she had grown up in Kolkata, which is the city where my dad, who was Bengali, was from. All of that kind of mesmerized me, just knowing that someone from the same part of the world as me, whose roots were in the same part of the world as mine, had made it big in Hollywood so many generations ago. This was around the time Slumdog Millionaire had just won Best Picture, right? And I think a lot of us really were hoping that Frida Pinto was going to be a huge
Yeah.
star, right? And so to know that there had been a South Asian woman who really, you know, rose to the highest ranks of Hollywood in such a deeply prejudiced time, it completely blew my mind, right? And so, during that period back in 2009, The Dark Angel, which was the film that she got her historic Best Actress nomination for, it was not easily findable. But what was, within reach for me was Wuthering Heights, which is arguably her most famous film, in which she played Kathy opposite Laurence Olivier's Heathcliff. And I just sought out that film, and I was so moved by her performance, just her kind of composure, her steeliness, her depth of feeling. My young mind could not really compute that someone who lived with such pain off screen, having to hide her heritage from the public, could produce work of such incredible quality, right? So I was a fan ever since that moment. And I remember as I began my career as a journalist and author, I kind of made it clear to my literary agent that I wanted to write a book about Merle Oberon eventually, but it took me a few years to get there.
I always love that everything comes back to Wuthering Heights. That is my favorite, one of my favorite movies, my favorite book of all time. It's the movie that I used to sell my first book. So, I love anybody that's part of the Wuthering Heights hive.
Mhm.
But you're totally right that I think that Merle Oberon often is, and I hate to say this because I think that this happens too often with classic film women, is more known for having to hide that. It's become this old Hollywood trope. If you saw, the Matt Bomer Last Tycoon series, Jennifer Beals character is playing a character that is akin to Merle Oberon and having to hide her race. And that has become its own thing. But in researching her, I remember in Princess Merle in the Charles Hyam book, it was more like, oh, she pretended her mom was her maid because her mom couldn't pass. And he didn't really seem to have a lot of sensitivity for that. How did you want to approach that? And what did you learn about how she had to live this kind of dual life?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I always had so much compassion for Merle, even though, as you pointed out, a lot of people didn't. When I was growing up, I read a lot of Oscar blogs, and I won't name specific ones, but so many of them tended to trash Merle. They used to say that she wasn't much of an actress or that she was a great beauty with this tragic backstory, right? They almost had this posture of pity towards her, which I wanted to really complicate through my own telling, because I wanted to really understand why she felt compelled to pass as white and to the extent to which that was even her choice, honestly, because I really needed to situate her within this broader system of discrimination that forced her hand in that sense, right? And so that was the sort of sentiment that I went into this project with, a sense of curiosity, wanting to know what really made her make certain decisions throughout her life. And through that, what I realized too is that there's so much in the Hyam and Mosley book that we're talking about that is just flat out misinformation, and a lot of that has been used as sort of grist to essentially write her off. It's abetted her erasure from public memory, if that makes sense, because a lot of people, they see Merle's story in the most superficial terms possible, right? They're like, oh, she passed as white. She must have hated herself. Oh, she pretended that the woman she thought was her mother, which we'll get to in a second, was her maid. Like, wow, she must have been so self-hating. And they don't understand the fact that, we're talking about a woman who grew up in what her family told me was abject poverty. She grew up in a time when being mixed race in India was absolutely, it put a target on her back, and she faced so much classism and racism in her home country, right? And that trailed her as she made a career for herself abroad in
Yeah.
Britain and America, right? And there's so many other kind of complex systems that are so much bigger than just her as an individual that were putting her in this sort of position where she had to conceal this aspect of her identity. And so I wanted to kind of draw that picture as clearly as possible for my readers.
I want to know I'm always fascinated when authors, especially authors who are tackling a topic that has not been done in several decades, like Merle. What was there a specific thing that the previous authors have gotten wrong that you made it your duty to rectify?
Oh my goodness, how much time do we have? There is so much, right? So I would say the main error from the Hyman Mosley book was, the question of who Merle's mother even was. So their understanding, despite them having, to my knowledge, access to her birth certificate, was that a woman named Charlotte Selby had been
Right.
um, Merle's mother, but something that her birth certificate and baptismal certificate made clear, in addition to conversations with her surviving family members from India whom I tracked down, is that her mother was actually Constance Selby, who was Charlotte's daughter. So she had given birth to Merle when she was 14 years old. And you can imagine the very tragic and violent circumstances that resulted in Merle's conception, right? But essentially, what Charlotte did was, she scooped Merle up herself. And Merle's birth name, by the way, was Estelle Merle Thompson, although her nickname was Queenie back in India, right? So she scooped Queenie up and said, "I'm going to pretend to be her mother, and Constance, you have to pretend to be her half sister." And so that was the knowledge with which Merle herself grew up, right, in India, that this girl, Constance, is just my half sister and everything like that. And Constance, she had been born in Colombo, what is today Sri Lanka, and she was half Sinhalese and half white. So a big part of my project entailed essentially making it very clear to my readers that Merle's mother was, in fact, Constance, this girl who had given birth to her when she was only a teenager and had to essentially give her up because of these, very awful and tragic circumstances, right? In addition to that, there are a few other charges in Hyman Mosley's book that, my research and reporting kind of refuted. One is that Merle is, in addition to being part Sinhalese, she's also part Maori, so indigenous to what is today New Zealand, right? And that is something that her family very vehemently disputed. They said, no, that's not true. And I was always kind of, looking for the source of that claim. And it came from the 1983 biography, right? And so I was like, huh, interesting. Because, you do sometimes see her on lists of Oscar nominees of indigenous descent, right? But
Right.
as far as we know, she was not Maori whatsoever, right? Even though Hyman Mosley's book claims she was. There are so many other claims. One thing that I see gain a lot of traction in online forums is that there was a point in 1949. This is hyper specific, but just stay with me here. There's a point in 1949 where Merle commissioned a portrait of the woman she thought was her mother, Charlotte, but demanded that the painter lighten the skin so that, that could maybe deflect any questions about her heritage. And in my conversation with the family, that painting was something that they provided for me, but there was no evidence whatsoever that, she asked the painter to lighten the skin or anything like that, right? Hyman Mosley also suggested that she intentionally bleached her skin, but I did not find evidence of that. I did find evidence of her having to undergo skin bleaching at the behest of studios, but it was not necessarily a voluntary decision on her end. So there are a lot. I mean, again, we could be here forever, and I think that I didn't want to spend too much space on the page itself, kind of refuting that text, you know what I mean? And saying like, well, in that book they claim blah blah blah. I just wanted to tell the truth of her story, as with as much clarity as possible.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I think people ignore the fact that Marilyn Monroe had plastic surgery, Rita Hayworth altered her appearance. I mean, the studio system really did a physical transformation of every one of the women that they worked with. I mean, you bring up Merle's family. I'm always fascinated by because we're seeing less and less of them nowadays, the children and the offspring of a lot of these stars. And I always think of Jean Tierney, who had, issues with her daughter and mental disability. Veronica Lake was not the best mother. Barbara Stanwyck was not the best mother. But from the sounds of what I've read, through Wikipedia, Merle had adopted two children and, had a close relationship. What did you discover about her family and her role as a mother off screen, her personal life?
Yeah, yeah, it's really tragic because her adopted son, Bruno Jr., actually died just a few years after Merle did,
Oh,
which is really terrible. But there is one, to my knowledge, surviving daughter of hers, Francesca, right? And other people I tracked down were her family members from India. So here's a very convoluted story, right? Basically, so after Merle's mother, Constance, gave birth to Merle, they sort of separated and, went down their different respective paths, right? And Constance would go on to marry a man from Goa and then have four more children. And one of those children had grown up thinking, oh, Merle Oberon's my aunt, right? Because, even his mother, who's also Merle's mother, told her other children, "Oh yes, Merle is my half sister. She was also a participant in this deception, right?" But anyway, later in Merle's life, as he came of age, he essentially tried to contact Merle when he came to America in the mid 1970s, and he was not very successful. He managed to call up her house in Malibu, and Merle allegedly pretended to be her maid, right, which was a kind of a callback to what happened back then in the 1930s when she first moved to London, and she hung up the phone. But essentially what I did was I found, that man, Harry Selby, right, who, would, after Merle's death and after his mother's death, learn that, he and Merle were in fact siblings rather than, aunt and nephew, right? And he unfortunately passed away in 2016, but he has surviving kind of next of kin, right? And so, how you can just kind of look at funeral listings or whatever and just kind of look at, he survived by blah, 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 this man, he had many children. And so I really pounded the pavement trying to find those people. And then, after a lot of false starts and everything like that, I finally found them because my big nagging question was actually, what was Merle's early life like? Because, believe it or not, I did have kind of a clearer sense through a lot of my archival research of what she was like as a mother. From my understanding, she was a kind and loving, generous mother who, you know, I think that she she could not give birth to her own biological children for other very tragic reasons that I talk about in the book. And so I think that when she did finally get the chance to adopt children, she, from my understanding, really doted on them and really made sure that she put two good people into the world. I believe that's a paraphrase of something that she told a reporter at one point. But I really want to know about her early life because it was shrouded in such mystery, and there was just so much misinformation, as I said earlier. And so finally, when I did find her relatives who'd grown up in India but now are kind of, scattered across the globe, right? I just talked to them and I got a much clearer picture of just what that early life was like, right? And, one of the difficulties of reporting a book like this is that, we're dealing with someone who was born in 1911. And so many people who would be keepers of any sort of knowledge about her, especially her early life, are now long gone, right? And when the only text that you really have to work from is the Hyman Mosley book, it presents a lot of difficulties, right? And so there were some questions that I had that didn't fully get answered, and I just kind of had to make peace with that. It's just part of the biographical process.
Exactly. No, you touch on why I have not tackled a biography yet in my life because A, I love firsthand accounts. And if anytime you're diving into these waters, firsthand accounts are rare, if not non-existent by this point. But I remember Scott Iman telling me when I told him the same thing, he was like, well, you just have to realize you're going to get to a point where the questions you want to get answered are never going to be answered, and you have to be cool with that. And I was like, but I'm not. I want to know, damn it. Which is why I have not tackled the biography space. So you were just reminding me again that, sometimes some things just are left a mystery. And ooh, that's hard for me.
I mean, yeah, it's really funny because in the acknowledgments of my book, I call Merle lovingly. I call her a biographer's nightmare, and because it is really difficult, and I can kind of understand why there hasn't been a biography of her in over 40 years. Part of it does have to do with the fact that, as you said, she is this sort of disregarded figure who doesn't have the same name recognition as a Vivian Leigh or Stanwyck or Joan Crawford or Betty Davis, Katharine Hepburn, what have you, right? But part of it too is the fact that, when you are looking at certain primary sources, they're filled with so many evasions and fictions that she maintained about her own life, right? And so that presents such a roadblock for a biographer. You're essentially mining this archival material, but trying to tread cautiously and make sure that you're not just repeating some misinformation that she was peddling for her own survival.
Is there a question that you got to the end of this project that didn't get answered that still kind of keeps you up at night?
Yes, yes, there is. And that is the question of whether she knew the identity of her real mother. I did not find any persuasive evidence that she did find that out. Her family did not believe that she knew either. And it was really tough because any letters and correspondences between the two of them, because they did keep in touch late into their respective lives, right? Um, all of those letters, apart from the remnants of one that I managed to find, have been lost. Every single source I tried to track them down through said, nope, they're not here. Like, we don't have them. Sorry, that kind of thing, right? And so I wish that, I really knew that answer definitively. But, the way that I present it in the introduction to the book is just that, her family does not believe she knew who her real mother was. And I have not found any persuasive evidence that suggests that they are incorrect in that belief, So, I mean, because I can't imagine that she would have known, though. And it's funny because I have talked to like a few Merle super fans, and there are like three of us, just like around the world generally, right? And one of my friends, he disagrees. He's like, no, she must have known. Come on. And I'm like, I don't know. I'm being a very traditional journalist about this, but
Right?
I don't see any, I don't see on any of these like immigration records or whatever, like, the proper name that would suggest that she knows who her real mom was. So
Well, and what's fascinating, and I wonder too how much of it is because there's always certain actors that are very evocative of their specific time period. To go back to Veronica Lake, very evocative of the 40s. You'd be hard pressed to find somebody that remembers that she made movies in the 50s. And Merle Oberon, I always hear a lot of people talk about her as a 30s actress, even though she made movies into the 1940s, into the 1950s. For you, I know we talk a lot about Hollywood racism, specifically with regards to Black performers, but was that something she dealt with that altered her career? I guess what was it about the 30s that made her work so well that didn't necessarily translate into the 40s or the 50s?
yeah, that's a great question. What I really sought to do with this book is kind of map her against this broader backdrop of South Asian representation generally in Hollywood, right? Because when Merle first arrived in Hollywood in late 1934, after kind of earning her stripes in British cinema earlier that decade, Boris Karloff, who is also of South Asian descent,
Right?
something that a lot of people don't seem to know, which boggles my mind, right? He was already, an established star. And of course, you could write an entire book about the fact that this man's two most iconic roles are of these characters who are kind of meant to be superficially villainous. Of course, there's more depth to both of them, right? But this brown man is like, playing these evil quote unquote characters, right? But she came after Boris Karloff, but prior to Sabu, who was another sort of, let's say, quote unquote, project of Alexander Korda, who later became Merle's first husband. And he was someone who, did not have the option of concealing his South Asian heritage from the public. And in fact, that really became his currency as, his film career began in the late 1930s and, kind of held steady through the 1940s. And he starred in all these sorts of, adventure films that were, set abroad, usually somewhere in South Asia, right? But I think for Merle, she had the advantage of coming to Hollywood in a time when black and white cinema could very much just quite literally cloak her from any sort of scrutiny about her appearance. It was much easier for her to quote unquote blend in. And I did, through my research and reporting, surface instances in which, as the industry was kind of moving towards Technicolor, her taking screen tests and then losing out on roles that she was promised because studios felt she did not look good in color, right? And, if you study her filmography, she actually made very few films in color. Like there's one like Over the Moon, which was, made in Britain with Rex Harrison. And then there was A Song to Remember in 1945, which was her first color film in years. But, even as late as 1956's Price of Fear, she's still acting in black and white. But I think that really that technology kind of worked to her advantage in some way. But I think that it also did hold her back in terms of what roles she did have at her disposal, because sometimes I did surface quite a few reports too of her starting to film movies and then someone on set feeling as though her skin became too brown to agree with the cameras, and so they would basically force her to go to a beauty salon and undergo skin bleaching, or they would like wait a week for her skin to fade and all that kind of stuff, right? So I definitely think that is a factor. In addition to that, I would say that as she aged, her skin actually became a lot darker, just generally, right? And I think that I don't know how to say this in a diplomatic way, but her heritage just became more obvious. Just like
Right?
it became a lot harder for her to pass as white, versus in the 1930s. Well, you look at some photos and you're like, yeah, I can see that, and in others I'm like, well, how on earth was she able to kind of conceal her heritage? But that certainly worked in her favor, and it's sad because I think too she is someone who, early in life, growing up in India, she was really ridiculed just for like the way in which she spoke, because it revealed her class roots and her mixed race roots. An old friend of hers from Kolkata, who is a white British woman, she said that Merle sounded like Eliza Doolittle pre-transformation, right? Just like hideous to listen to. And so this is a woman who, went to a vocal coach and everything and learned how to speak in this very patrician way, right? But I think that was an inhibitor in some ways too in her acting career, because, I have so much affection for Merle, and I think that she was such a brilliantly talented actress, right? But there was also, I think, a hesitation on her end to kind of fully submit to a role completely and just like let loose, right? And you see her she doesn't really tackle accent work in the same way, Viv did with Gone with the Wind or whatever and everything like that. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that, she was always acting, right? She was always just like, there's so much that she needed to conceal. And I think that she was likely very afraid of, the truth emerging in some sort of way, in that sonic way, let's say.
I mean, from the sounds of it, I think a lot of people, when they say Merle Oberon was passing, they assume that, it's because this is a woman that is, feverishly putting on makeup to try to hide things, or otherwise just having this self-loathing, kind of like the Susan Conner character in Imitation of Life. But from the way you're describing it, it was kind of a mutual thing. The studio was also trying to emphasize, and I mean, did you, I guess at the end of this, Hyam's accusation kind of that she hated her heritage and she was feverishly trying to hide it at all costs, did that have any merit to it?
I think that it may have been true in some respects, but you are exactly right that I think a lot of people tend to cast Merle as a sort of Sarah Jane character, right? Someone who just completely hated her heritage until, the day of the funeral, and then she's, crying at her
Right?
mom's, casket, right? But no, I sense something, a more kind of tense conflict. It's so interesting because, in addition to what I said earlier regarding my attempts to really make sure I was situating her story within the kind of broader history of South Asian representation in Hollywood, I was also mapping her story against just the history of South Asian immigration in America, because something that a lot of people don't know about Merle's life is the fact that, yes, of course, the Hays Code and its injunctions against, miscegenation, interracial romance, whatever you want to call it, are certainly things that failed her career and, essentially made her have to pass as white. But in addition to that, she also came to America in a time when immigration from India had been banned from 1917 until 1946, right? And in addition to that, Indians were ineligible from obtaining citizenship because of their race, okay? And so she had to hide her racial identity and she had to obfuscate her birthplace because otherwise she could not have had any sort of place of permanence in America. And I don't
Right.
think that people totally understand that. And I think one of the tragedies of Merle's story, and I'm wary of just casting it as a tragedy because I think it's also really triumphant, and I don't want to kind of adopt that posture of pity that I was saying earlier. But one of the tragedies truly of her story is that the culture and just American society at large, it moved past that sort of animus that a lot of South Asians had to deal with back in that country. Like by the mid 1960s, immigration law opens up to such a degree that, a lot of Indian immigrants are coming to America, right? And, the counterculture kind of fosters this sort of scenario in which a lot of people are listening to Ravi Shankar and, they're eating Indian food and everything like that. And all of a sudden, all these aspects of her culture that people kind of taught her to feel shame about were now in vogue, right? And it was so much fun to, do that sort of archival research in like the late 1960s through the late 1970s, kind of like last decade of her life, and find her sharing recipes for curry with like newspaper columnists, right? And curry, for better or for worse, was back then kind of like the dish associated with India in the American mind, right? She was wearing dresses made from saris. And then this was the big revelation for me, or one of the big revelations is that so after her last film, Interval, came out in 1973, she agreed to star in a biopic of Gandhi as Gandhi's wife, Kasturba Gandhi, right? And of course, she did not end up playing that role, right? But I remember I was just so fascinated by that because back in the 1930s, when Goldwyn had his paws on her, right? He would certainly have never let her play anything of the sort, right? He always wanted her to play these like kind of virginal, like white English women, essentially. But the fact that she was in a place of, I think, kind of self-acceptance in the late 1960s to early 1970s. It was really surprising, right? But that was kind of coming up against just her need to keep this lie going because, this is a lie that was created for her. She back in the early 1930s when London Film signed her, their publicist created this backstory for her, and it's not as if she were in a position to by the early 1970s be like, hey everyone, I was lying, so I'm actually actually born in India and my mom's brown. Okay, thanks, bye. Like she had a very high public profile like that, so I had a lot of empathy for her.
I love that. I mean, as we're starting to wrap this up, you, of course, any good biographer worth their salt has seen all the films. Is there a Merle movie that you think deserves more recognition, something that's underseen that you urge people after reading this, of course, to go seek out and find?
100%. And it is this movie called Till We Meet Again that was made in 1940. It was the first movie that she made with Warner Brothers, which is, who signed her after she and Goldwyn parted ways. A lot of people probably think that Wuthering Heights was a smashing success, but it really wasn't. And, it was kind of a mutual decision between Merle and Goldwyn to kind of, just end their partnership after that sort of fizzled out at the box office, right? But Till We Meet Again, she plays this woman named Joan Ames, who is suffering from this fatal heart ailment. And she boards a cruise ship and she falls in love with a man, I believe it's George Brent, who she does not know this, but he is a convicted criminal who
Oh,
is
it's
awaiting
the remake of One Way Passage.
passage. Exactly. Yeah, totally. And it's funny because a lot of people know what one way passage is, but they've like like, what's Till We Meet Again? I think it's been shown on TCM like a grand total of 3 times, probably. So like literally I had to watch it on some like very sketchy website, right? But she is just remarkable. Like it is one of those classic women's pictures that I think a lot of people have just forgotten unfairly, but it really shows you what she was capable of because, the character herself is like very sympathetic, right? But Merle hits every single note so beautifully, and it really shows you that under Goldwyn, with The Dark Angel, but then especially with Wuthering Heights, like those movies really forced her to grow as an actress, but they don't show precisely what she was capable of. And I think that Merle's best performances were in the early 1940s. Till We Meet Again, I'm really partial to, but then there's also one called Lydia, that was
It's a
directed by
great one.
she. And again, it's such a showcase for her, right? Because she gets to play all these different notes. She's like, kind of bratty and whatnot, and like young and like, vibrant, but then she's also like old and grizzled and everything like that. And the whole spectrum, you just see what a star she was. But Till We Meet Again is the one movie that I feel like deserves a much wider viewership, and I do hope people seek it out after reading my book.
What I mean, I know you're promoting this book, and I've always get asked this question, what's the next book? And I always say, why are we asking this? What are we talking about the next one? Let me get the first one
Oh,
out. But I'm curious, I mean, if future biographies, is there a star or somebody that you would love to write about in future?
that is a great question. Yeah, I have been just this kind of been nagging at me, right? Because there's so many stars who fascinate me. Boris Karloff, we just mentioned, Sabu, right? There are some Indian film stars whose lives I want to chronicle because I grew up on Indian cinema, right? But the question is there an audience for that sort of book in America? Because even getting a deal for Merle was very tough.
I
And
bet.
I'm not a debut author, right? Like I had my first book came out in late 2021, and it was about food. That's kind of where I cut my teeth, so to speak, as a writer before pursuing this
You have
passion.
multitude. You contain
Yeah,
multitude.
exactly.
So
Right? But I've wondered, who would be fitting because I think what scares me, my mind, for example, always returns to Vivian Lee, right? But there is no shortage of writing on her, and I think that a lot of people ask, well, what's the use of another book on Vivian Lee, right? And so part and same goes with Boris Karloff. There have been quite a few books on Boris, and some I would say were truly definitive, right? So, I think the question for me now is like, okay, would I want to tackle someone who's been written about a lot, or, go for someone who's kind of a little more under the radar, like Merle is, for example, Unfairly So, and kind of bring them back into the public consciousness. So, jury's out on that. I'm trying to get this book out of the door and, see what happens. See.
exactly. Focus on Merle, then working on the next project. I know. I always tell people because I'm doing it right now, never write more than one book at a time. It is hell. You will regret it. I am not feeling a way about doing that currently at all.
Oh.
But oh my gosh, thank you so much for wanting to sit down and chat with me. For everybody that is trying to find something to read, Love Queenie is out by the time this comes out. It will be out, so please go buy it wherever you buy your books, preferably independent booksellers. But honestly, you're an author, I'm an author. Any bookstore worth its salt is fine. We will take that. Where can fans find you online, get in touch, learn more about where you're going on your book tour, all of that?
Yeah, the best way to follow me is through Instagram. My Instagram is mayukh.sen. That is Mayukh.sen. So, my website and everything is linked there too, but that's the best way to follow me. So,
That's going to close out this edition of Ticklish Business because Emily and I are working on a multitude of projects. We are going to be doing the show monthly or on an as needed basis for right now. But you can always follow us over wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We are still there. We do have our beleaguered YouTube channel. You can also find our archive, which is always free, going back to episode 1 at ticklishbusiness.podbean.com. Even though we are going to a monthly format, we still have a ton of stuff that we are hoping to do. So we do encourage you to continue becoming a patron. If you aren't one already, staying a patron. If you already are, you can go to patreon.com/ticklishbiz. We thank everybody who has continued to offer their support. Even though we on a hiatus. If you want to support our independent projects, the things that are actually keeping us afloat in these weird times, you can follow Emily over at Ms. Emily Edwards on social media and learn more about her Viviana Valentine books. You can always find me on all social media at Kristen Lopez 88, and I do have a Substack where I talk about literature and disability and all sorts of things when I'm not working on a multitude of books. You can subscribe to that if you want at thefilmmaven.substack.com. We will be back soon with more episodes. We thank you for listening to this, and we will be back soon. Till then.